So we're going to go ahead and start. Today we are having a follow-up discussion from one of my groups about the importance of creating boundaries for greater healing. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we discussed in that group. We began by looking in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi, chapters 4 and 5. And in 2 Nephi, we see that Lehi, the father of this family, has died. And the history of this family is that the two oldest sons were very abusive and mistreated their younger brother and their parents, and really kind of terrorized the whole family. And in 2 Nephi chapter 4, Lehi dies, and God commands Nephi, the younger brother, to leave the older brothers. So they have their own families, their wives and their children, and they take off and they go, and they are commanded to create boundaries to protect them from their older brothers, who are not only unhappy at this point, they are murderous. And so God commands them to create boundaries. And in more than one instance in the scriptures, in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, and in the Book of Mormon, we read times when God has commanded prophets or families or even whole groups of people to create healthy boundaries for their safety and for their well-being. And so in the church, in the Latter-day Church, the modern-day church, sometimes that can be really difficult. And that's not just a problem that we find in the church, but it's also a problem that we see in society and in families in general. Another thing that I read in our group discussion originally was from this book called Strengthening Our Families, an in-depth look at the Proclamation on the Family, and it's out of the School of Family Life from Brigham Young University. And this quote says, "Ultimately, healing from abuse in the Lord's way involves leaving behind false and destructive family beliefs, traditions, loyalties, or even ties when they serve to disregard the sanctity of life. As has been alluded to already, when one has the power, mentally and physically, to protect oneself or other vulnerable people, one has the right and the responsibility to do so, even if it means the disruption of family relationships. In no instance has the Lord decreed that we should tolerate ongoing abuse or to resign ourselves to a lifetime of unrighteous demands from those who should care for us." So, social scientists have done research about what makes a happy marriage and what makes a happy family. And there are a few different things. Communication is one. It's a big thing. But also boundaries are very important. So why would boundaries be so important? Why have they actually done research on it? And what have they found? So we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries tonight. Why has God used them? Why have scientists shown that they are important to family health and happiness? As we discuss a little bit, I think that will become more clear. So first of all, what are boundaries? And if you have any comments, please go ahead and make a comment here. To those who are in my group, I'm not going to say your names because you've asked for privacy, so just know that I see you and I'm glad that you are here. So what are boundaries? Well, boundaries are not a way to control people. They are not a means that, or a tool that we use to get what we want and to manipulate others. That's not what boundaries are. So what are they? Well, boundaries are something that are meant to protect ourselves and to protect our families. And so while we're talking about boundaries, I'd like you to think about yourself and think about what kind of boundaries you have, what kind of boundaries maybe you had in your family growing up, and what kind of boundaries have you been able to build for your own children? Because while my passion is helping adults heal from abuse and find healthy relationships, that is driven by the need to protect our children. because the children that we've brought into this world do not have to suffer the way that we have suffered. And all we have to do is make a decision to abandon the things that our families did, our families of origin, or the places that we grew up, and to create new patterns for our families of procreation, or our children, and the families that we brought into this world. And I say that, but it's not like it's an easy thing to do. Boundaries, creating boundaries and maintaining boundaries is really difficult. Very, very, very difficult. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let me ask you a question. I'd like you to think about where you live. If you live in a home or an apartment, I want you to think about where your property lines are. Where does what belongs to you end from another person? Okay? From their space. Where is that? Is it a fence? Is it a door? Is it an apartment building? Where are those property boundaries? So if you take a look at those things, it's not very difficult to see where your space ends and another person's begins. And in fact, if somebody came into your home, you would yell, you would scream, you would call 911, you would tell them to get out. There's no reason why they should be there or why you should allow them there. And while that is physical property, it's also our emotional well-being. So if you think about your life as a house and you think about your family as a home, you think about where is the street, okay? And who's allowed in the street? Where is the sidewalk and who is allowed on the sidewalk? I live on a busy street and anybody can go down the street and anybody can walk on the sidewalk. But most people don't come up the driveway. And if they did, it would seem weird. So they don't come up the driveway. Also, when they get to my stoop, to my steps, not anybody's going to be there. But if I open my door, I still have a decision about who I can let inside or if they have to stay out. Correct? So there are boundaries up to our home and to ourselves, but then there are even more boundaries that we have to look at. Who do you allow into your front room? You allow maybe someone that you know from church or from school or from work, and you allow them to come in. And what kinds of things do you share with them? You share with them surface things, not the nitty-gritty details necessarily. And then into your kitchen, and so on and so forth, into the inner parts of your home and of your life and of your emotional well-being. So if your life is like your house, then why would we not need boundaries? We do need boundaries. We need boundaries. So I have, a couple of years ago, I posted something on the Breaking Abuse page where it said, in order for a wound to heal, you need to stop touching it. And so I likened it into this. So imagine that you have a wound. Let's say that a family member has gone crazy and maybe shot you in the leg. And it hurts a lot. So you're going to run around and you're going to be upset and you're going to ask for help. But every time you go to a family member, you're not getting help. Maybe they shoot you again. And you keep going and you keep going and you keep going to the next person because you need somebody to help you. And yet you're not getting help from these people. And in these situations, this is very much about what happens in abusive situations. Because most often, when you've been abused by a family member, the other family members, and research has supported this, and there's not a lot of research about this, but the research that is out there supports the fact that the other family members feel like they have to choose sides. And people tend to do what is easiest. They tend to want to be comfortable. They don't like to mess with the status quo. And so they will support the abuser if it means protecting the family. So here an abuse victim is running around asking for help, crying because they've been shot in the leg and nobody is helping them. And eventually you get to the point where you go to the hospital for help. And in the case of emotional trauma, the hospital is Jesus Christ. That is where you can go. That is who you can go to for help. And professionals, mental health professionals, and friends who you can trust. There are areas that you can go for trust. But the point is this: The point is that you have to create boundaries, space for you to heal. So what do we need to do? What are certain aspects about boundaries that we need to think about? Number one is that boundaries have to be clear, and boundaries are very personal. What is a boundary for me may not be what you need, and what is a boundary for you might be really not what I need, and it might even be damaging to me. And so when you're creating your boundaries, it's important to think about what you need, take the time to decide what you need and who you need it from, and then you decide how to make those boundaries clear. So you have clear boundaries, and then those boundaries have to be consistent. Consistency is key. So here's a couple of different examples of maybe what is a boundary or what is not a boundary. Okay, so here's something that is not a boundary. Okay, so for those who are dating, and I know that most adults out there, I guess, are not dating anymore. I am single, so I date every so often. So let's take in this situation someone who's dating and maybe they don't get a call back. Okay, you become what? You become upset, maybe you're frustrated, you're confused about why that's not happening. But even though you're having negative feelings about it, it's not infringing on your basic human rights, and that is not a boundary violation. Okay, you can ask if they will call you back, but the important thing is that you not hang your happiness based on their reaction, because at that point, what you're doing is trying to manipulate or control them for your own benefit. So that is not a situation that involves boundaries. Let's talk about another situation. Maybe somebody has a habit of coming to your house and knocking on the door at any time, and they want to come in. Let's say it's a mother-in-law. I don't have one right now, so let's say a mother-in-law comes over and is knocking on your door, and she just loves you, and she loves your kids, and she wants to come in, and she wants to play with those kids, and she wants to have fun with them, and so she comes over, and you let her in because you don't really know what to say, even though not calling ahead of time and different things like that might feel like a violation of your privacy and of your boundaries. But the thing is that if boundaries are not expressed, they're not actually boundaries. They have to be clear and they have to be consistent. So what choice do you have at this point? Well, you can tell her what you need. You can ask her to call before she comes over. If she has a habit of walking in, you can ask for her to knock before she comes over. There are options here. What do you need from her? But is it just about telling her what you need? You also need to express what the consequences will be. So there are 3 C's when we talk about boundaries. Boundaries need to be clear, consistent, and they need to have consequences attached to them. So if you have expressed clearly what you need, and then you are consistent about it, then there needs to be a consequence attached to it. In this instance, you could say something like, well, I would prefer that you please call before you come over and that you knock. I will be keeping the door locked, and if I'm not able to come to the door, or if you haven't called, I probably won't be able to answer the door, and that is what I need from you. And the hard part for most people is in following up on those things, is in having the consequences attached to it. So when we talk about healing from abuse, why do you need boundaries in order to heal from abuse? Because we've talked a little bit about dating and how not getting a call back is not a violation of your boundaries. And we've talked about the mother-in-law who comes over whenever she wants, and if she's playing with the kids and you don't say anything, she probably thinks that it's just fine for her to be playing with the kids. Well, if you haven't expressed those boundaries, you're going to be sitting there and you're going to grow in resentment and frustration. And at that point, you really have no one to blame except for yourself. And as adults, when we were children, as adults who were survivors of abuse, when we were children, we did not have control. Other people had control over us. And so it's not like we had the ability to really set boundaries. now that we are adults, we do have the ability to set boundaries. We have the responsibility to do so. And we do not have to continue to hand over our power to anybody else. It doesn't matter if it's a family member, an abuser, a neighbor, a church member. We don't have to give that power to anybody else. That is our power. It's ours. And nobody else can take it from you. So you must decide, what do you need? What do you need? Do you need someone to call? Do you need space to just not have to answer calls? You know, again, boundaries are very personal. They're very personal, and you're the only person who can decide what your boundaries need to be, and and how you decide to reinforce those boundaries. So why is it so hard to set boundaries? As an adult who is a survivor of abuse, I know that for myself, I lived for years in so much pain and an inability to just see the light at the end of the tunnel because I didn't have boundaries. I didn't even know what boundaries looked like because I had grown up in a home where there were not boundaries. And the boundaries that looked like boundaries weren't actually boundaries. They were more of a pretending to be a boundary. So as an adult, it took me a lot of time to figure out that boundaries didn't exist, but that they needed to exist. And so it took me some time to figure out how to do that. And until that point, I was hurting a lot. I couldn't heal. They kept coming over. They kept telling me things like, you're crazy, you're a bad mother, you've done all of these things to bring shame onto our family, you're lying, you're, you know, a willing participant, you're just playing victim, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You can't heal because they just keep wounding you over and over and over and over and over again. So you have to create boundaries in order to heal. And it's okay to do that. And that's the important thing, is to know that it is okay. And you need to do that. You need to do that for yourself. Because when I was finally able to create boundaries, guess what happened? I started to heal. I started to heal. I could breathe again. I was able to finally start rebuilding my life. And it took a long time. And I'm still rebuilding my life. Because where I was 2 years ago is not where I'm at today. And where I was a year ago is not where I'm at today. And where I was yesterday is not where I'm at today, because I created boundaries. So why is it so hard to create boundaries? Well, we've talked about the importance of them being clear and being consistent. But even if they are clear and even if they are not consistent, even if we are consistently clear about our boundaries, it's not going to matter if we are not able to enforce those boundaries. And that is the difficult part. That is what is so hard for anybody. And for a survivor of abuse, that's why it feels impossible, because you grew up feeling like it wasn't okay to say no. You grew up feeling like you didn't have the right to have an opinion, and their voice was your voice. So you didn't have a voice. But you're an adult now and you have a voice. And all you have to do is you have to stand up and you have to use that voice, and you have to tell them what you want and what you do not want. So when we are consistently clear, because we know we want boundaries and we even know what they want, what we want them to be, the problem comes when we don't follow through. Why would we not follow through? Well, in the case of maybe the mother-in-law situation that we talked about a few minutes ago, she didn't want to tell her mother-in-law and to follow up on this because she could imagine how it would make her feel. And of all of the abuse victims that I have talked to, the overwhelming, every single one, I have never ever met an abuse victim that did not have empathy for other people. We know how it made us feel. We wouldn't want to make someone else feel that way. No, we don't want to do that. We want to be kind. We don't want to treat other people the way that we were treated. So that goes back to what the very first thing we said is when we defined are boundaries. What a boundary is. A boundary is not a way to control people. A boundary is a way to protect ourselves. So in my case and in my life, when I finally stood up and said no more, first of all, I do not feel that that strength came from myself. I feel like it came from God. I had never before even imagined that families are forever was not going to be what I knew on this earth. So I never thought, oh, I need to take boundaries that cut contact off between myself and my parents and my brothers and whoever else chooses to support my abuser, who was my older brother. And so when I finally took those steps, I was serious. And I feel grateful. I'm grateful that that determination and that resolve came from a place that was not within myself, because I was so broken at that point that I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I certainly didn't know that the path to getting towards the light at the end of the tunnel was going to be boundaries. And so I began to consistently be clear that I was not going to allow phone calls or texts or emails or any sort of contact. And it took a couple of years before that clear consistency finally kicked in. And it did finally kick in because I was able and willing to follow through on the consequences. I was very clear. I was very determined, and under no means whatsoever, no circumstance was it okay for them to contact me and to contact my children. And that last part took a little bit of a longer time. And the final key for me was pretty extreme, but it worked. I filed for a protective order in the courts here in the United States. And there was an incident that had happened a couple of years previous that made it possible for that to be something that could be granted. I was missing a couple of pieces of documentation, and so it wasn't granted. However, they knew that I was serious because I had gone to those lengths, and that was enough. And that's when it stopped. And that's when I could finally breathe. Because every day that I was away from my abusers and away from my abusers' supporters, I was able to heal a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And healing from abuse is difficult anyway. It doesn't matter how much abuse. If you were a child when you were abused, if you're getting out of an abusive marriage, if you've just had a really toxic friendship or maybe a relationship at work, the best thing and the most crucial thing that you do is create boundaries so that you can heal. Because if we are wounded and someone keeps poking their fingers around in that wound, it's never going to heal. It just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't work. And so, like in the Book of Mormon, when we talk about boundaries, or in the Bible when we talk about boundaries, I want to encourage you to go and read your scriptures. Go and read and look for moments when God has commanded or guided someone to create boundaries. What do those look like? They look like something, don't they? Something different maybe for each person. When Moses parted the Red Sea, what was he doing? What was that? Was that creating a boundary? It was definitely creating a boundary, wasn't it? For a group of people who had been persecuted and abused to be safe from those who were abusing them. God led them to create boundaries. In the Book of Mormon, Nephi was commanded to take those who were following him and who were following God and to leave those who were not. That was creating a boundary. At the end of the Book of Mormon, Moroni was the only man left who was living righteously. And what did he do? Did he just sit there and suffer or risk his life? He did not. He left, and he walked, and he went by himself. And in a lot of ways, there have been times when I have felt a lot like that. I have felt like God has decided that this is what I need to do, and yet all of my extended family chose my family side. And so I ended up alone for a lot of the time. And yet, because I had those boundaries, I could take a deep breath, and I was healing, and I was regaining my sense of awareness of my divine nature and of the person who I was. And I knew that God loved me. And I knew that the things that had happened to me were not my fault, and that they were things that I could get through with the help of Jesus Christ. Because I was away from all of that, I was able to rediscover the person that I had been years and years and years ago. And that's what you can have as well. As you create boundaries, and as they are clear and consistent, and as you follow through on the consequences for them, whatever you decide the consequences need to be, and I encourage you to make those decisions with God, with Jesus Christ, and to listen to the Spirit when you make those boundaries. I promise you that you will find healing, that you will find the ability to breathe and to create a place to raise your children and your grandchildren free from the effects of abuse. And that is what I have experienced. And I will be honest, healing takes a long time. I grew up in a family with very unhealthy patterns for relationships, very unhealthy coping skills and communication skills and all of these other skills that we need as adults to be stable and to be happy. And as an adult, when I had my boundaries, it gave me space to learn these new skills and to learn how to relate to other people in ways that most people see as normal. Growing up in an abusive home, you don't know what normal is. And as long as you're around that abuse, you will never know what normal is. And as long as you're allowing those patterns to follow you and to create doubt and confusion, you will never know what normal is. You will never know what happy and what peace is. Because when you are living in that situation and you come out of it, there are attachment things. You might be anxious, or you might have learned how to avoid. There are many, many unhealthy patterns that we bring with us. But once we are away from that, we can sort all of that out. We can see a therapist, we can go to school, we can do all of those things, and we can learn how to become healthy and functional and able to relate to people in a normal way. And that is what I want for you, and that is what I want for anyone who is hurting, regardless of the reason why you are hurting. That is what I hope for you. And so I encourage you to do the work to find happiness, to do the work to create boundaries, and to do the work to maintain those boundaries, because it is work and it is hard, but it is important. And it is the only way that you can be healthy and that you can be happy. And I wish you all the best. Please, if you have questions, I know that because I was streaming from 2 different devices to 2 different places, it's difficult to answer questions that I see popping up on the screen. So please ask the questions in the post, and I will answer them as quickly as I can. And I wish you all a good night.